Hello everyone! For 2026's Lantern Rite, Zibai, the White Horse Adeptus, will be the new 5-star character releasing in the second half of patch Luna 4. With Columbina releasing in the first half of the patch as a meta-defining lunar support, Zibai further expands the lunar archetype by being the third lunar main DPS who plays around the third lunar reaction that is introduced in patch Luna 4, Lunar-Crystallize. And with the right teams, she's looking to be one of the newest best DPSs in the game, numbers-wise. So in this guide, I will be explaining how Zibai works, the best ways to build her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pool value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations, while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC, including plenty of pre-release calcs on Zibai from multiple different theory crafters. Zibai's kit revolves entirely around the new lunar reaction that is introduced for her release patch, so let's go over the details of Lunar-Crystallize. Normally, when an enemy is affected by Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, and then you apply Geo, regular Crystallize will trigger, spawning a shard on the field you can pick up for a small shield that scales with the level and elemental mastery of the Geo unit who triggered the reaction. This can be somewhat helpful for interruption resistance or to enable Geo resonance and artifact sets like Archaic Petra, but ultimately it isn't really a good reaction. But when you have Zibai or Columbina on the team, you can access Lunar-Crystallize. Lunar-Crystallize only works when Geo reacts with Hydro. Other elements will only trigger regular Crystallize, not the lunar version. Once Hydro plus Geo happens, instead of spawning a Crystallize shard, 3 Moondrifts will spawn surrounding the enemy, each acting as a Geo construct, but they won't be taken into account in the regular Geo construct limit of 3. So the Moondrifts spawned from Lunar-Crystallize will activate Geori second dulls as they count as a construct, and Zhongli can still place his pillar on the field with the 3 Moondrifts present, allowing all 4 constructs to resonate. Once you trigger Lunar-Crystallize a total of 3 times, each of the Moondrifts will fire an attack on the enemy, and this is called Moondrift Harmony. Each of these attacks are single target. So for example, you trigger one Lunar-Crystallize at the start of the battle, you spawn the Moondrifts. You trigger a second one, nothing happens. Then you trigger a third Lunar-Crystallize, and the 3 Moondrifts will each fire an attack on the enemy. Afterwards, the Moondrifts still stay on the field, but after another 3 Lunar-Crystallizes, they will each fire again, and so on. So 3 Lunar-Crystallize reactions equals damage. If enemies do move out of range, more copies of Moondrifts will spawn when triggering another Lunar-Crystallize reaction closer to where the enemy now is, and the attacks will just come from the 3 nearest Moondrifts to the enemy. Now normally, Crystallize has a 1-second global ICD, meaning that even with all the Hydro and Geo application in the world, you could only trigger a maximum of 1 Crystallize reaction every second. But with Lunar-Crystallize, this global ICD has reportedly been removed. As a result, teams can trigger more Lunar-Crystallize reactions, allowing for more damage from the Moondrifts. How Lunar-Crystallize's reaction damage is calculated works very similarly to Lunar Charged. Instead of having a single character being a trigger for the reaction, with only their stats scaling the damage, Lunar-Crystallize counts every character that participates in the reaction. Since you need 3 Lunar-Crystallizes before the reaction deals damage, the game will track which characters contributed a Hydro Aura or applied Geo for those 3 reactions. For instance, if you have one unit applying a Hydro Aura and 3 Geo units that each trigger 1 Lunar-Crystallize when they apply Geo, all of them will share reaction ownership for 1 instance of reaction damage. Once the game sees which characters are taking part in the reaction, it will calculate the individual Lunar-Crystallize damage for each character using their stats with the damage formula. To briefly summarize the key parts, the reaction damage scales with character level. The base reaction damage buff from character passives. For Lunar-Crystallize, there's 14% from Zibai's passive and 7% from Columbina's. Elemental mastery, lunar reaction damage bonus but not elemental damage bonus. Enemy Geo res but not their defense. A character's crit stats, and lastly elevation, which is a special and potent stat buff that comes from 5-star character constellations. So for every character that provided a Hydro Aura and applied Geo to trigger the 3 Lunar-Crystallize reactions, a damage number for the reaction will be calced for each of them. Then to get the final damage of the reaction, the game adds up all the individual numbers. However, just like Lunar Charge, only the highest damage number gets full value. The second highest number gets halved, and the third and fourth highest damage numbers, if there are 3 or 4 total characters that contributed to the reaction, gets multiplied by 1/12 before getting summed up. As a result, most of the damage comes from the top 2 contributors, which will generally be the characters with the most crit and EM. But of course, because of crit variance, the ranking of contributors toward the Lunar-Crystallize reaction can slightly change depending on whether or not an individual character crits or not, resulting in some variability in the reaction damage. And just like the other 2 lunar reactions, certain character abilities such as from Zibai and Columbina can deal direct Lunar-Crystallize damage. This damage also doesn't apply any element, and the damage formula is very similar to the formula for Lunar-Crystallize reaction damage, so it scales with mostly the same stats. but instead of scaling with character level, it just takes into account the abilities multiplier and stat scaling. Zibai's talents and abilities scale with defense, while Columbina's scale with HP. In addition, the damage of direct Lunar-Crystallize has a special multiplier of 1.6. Then, any additive extra damage, such as the quill-like bust from Illuga's burst, are added before taking into account enemy geo-res but not defense, crit, and elevation from Constellations. For characters that have direct Lunar-Crystallize in their kit, it will generally be their main significant source of damage. Lastly, many things in the game that were enabled by triggering normal Crystallize have been updated to work with Lunar-Crystallize as well. Just to name a few key examples, Archaic Petra and Geo-Resonance can be activated by triggering Lunar-Crystallize, and Navia's Shrapnel stacks can now be obtained through Lunar-Crystallize as well. With Lunar-Crystallize covered, let's delve into Zibai's kit. She is a 5-star Geo Sword character who ascends with crit damage. Since she's the 5-star main DPS for Lunar-Crystallize, her special passive enables the reaction for the team, buffs the base damage of it by 14% with at least 2000 defense, and counts as a character for Moon Sign. She primarily scales with defense while also benefiting a little bit from EM since Lunar reactions have EM scaling. And with Zibai's A4 passive, other Geo characters on the team will give her 15% defense each, and other Hydro characters on the team will give her 60 EM each, incentivizing just Geo and Hydro characters for a pure Lunar-Crystallize comp. Zibai's elemental skill encapsulates the vast majority of her kit. Using it makes her enter an enhanced state called the Lunar Phase Shift mode for 15 seconds. During this enhanced state, she gets some interruption resistance, Geo-infused attacks, and the ability to gain a unique resource called Phase Shift Radiance, indicated by a bar next to her character, to use a special elemental skill called Spirit Steed Stride. This special skill deals 2 instances of damage, with the second hit being direct Lunar-Crystallize damage that is also further buffed by Zibai's defense with her A1 passive and will thus be her main source of damage. Now, to use the special skill, Zibai needs 70 Phase Shift Radiance points, indicated when the moon symbol on her bar lights up, and she can hold a max of 100 points. There are 3 ways that Zibai can get these points. First, she gains 10 points every second while in her enhanced state. Second, she gains 5 points every time she hits an enemy with a normal attack, and third, with Ascended Gleam active, she gains 35 points when the party triggers a Lunar-Crystallize reaction, though there is a special cooldown limiting 1 instance of point accrual for each special skill usage, so you can't just trigger 2 Lunar-Crystallize reactions to get 70 points for 1 skill. At C0, Zibai will exit her enhanced state after using 4 special skills, so her general C0 gameplay will just be using normal attacks until she has enough points to use her special skill 4 times. Now, Zibai's normal attack string consists of 4 total attacks, but with Ascended Gleam, her 4th and final normal attack will deal an additional instance of direct Lunar-Crystallize damage. So ideally, you finish her entire attack string without dodging, so you don't interrupt it, which is denoted as her N4, before using her special skill. Zibai's Elemental Burst simply deals 2 instances of damage, with the second hit being direct Lunar-Crystallize damage. It will also extend the duration of her enhanced state by 1.7 seconds, which just compensates the time lost for the burst animation. It's not that important to use every rotation, so just use it whenever it's available, generally every other rotation. Lastly, her Exploration passive allows her to passively gain energy at night while out of combat in the overworld, and I believe she also enables the use of these special carriages that travel around Leeway. That's everything on Zibai's base kit. For talent leveling priority, her elemental skill is pretty much her entire kit, so level up that first, then her burst. In terms of her attack combos, Zibai is a very straightforward character to play. Ideally, if her burst isn't available, at C0 she will first use her skill to enter her enhanced state, then do 4 normal attacks to complete her entire normal attack string, and 4. And by this time, you will generally have enough Phase Shift Radiance points to use her Spirit Steed Stride special skill, and she'll just do this a total of 4 times. Now, if her burst is available, you will do the same thing, but you can just replace one of the N4s with her elemental burst. Zibai will typically burst every other rotation, so you simply just alternate between the 2 combos. Zibai's C1 does allow you to use 1 additional special skill every rotation and will instantly give you 100 points when you enter her enhanced state. So if you do have this constellation, just add an extra skill usage immediately after entering her enhanced state. While there may be some post-release optimizations, this is the commonly used ideal rotation used in most team calcs. Now, I do want to reiterate that for the max damage, Zibai is incentivized to complete her entire normal attack string, her N4, because her 4th and final normal attack does a small extra direct Lunar-Crystallize hit with Ascendant Gleam. However, if you do her first 2 normal attacks, then dash or dodge, her next 2 normal attacks that you perform aren't going to be her 3rd and 4th hits, but back to hits number 1 and 2, missing that extra direct Lunar-Crystallize hit that comes from her 4th and final hit, unless you have her C4. It's definitely not going to be the end of the world if you can't finish her N4, but to get the theoretical most damage out of Zibai, without C4, she doesn't want to dodge while in the middle of her normal attacks, making her likely to face tank more enemy hits. Next, here are the best builds for Zibai. For weapons, her signature light-bearing moonshard is her clear best in slot. Gives a ton of crit damage, defense, and damage bonus for Lunar-Crystallize after using an elemental skill. For 5-star weapon alternatives, Uraku Misigiri is her next best option as it gives a lot of crit damage and some defense. And Zibai does benefit a little from the normal attack and elemental skill damage bonus because she does deal some non-lunar damage. Light of Foliar Incision is also a good option as it also gives a lot of crit and some extra damage with EM stats, giving a little bit more value to EM on her. She can also use Splendor of Tranquil Waters mainly because of its large crit damage substat and Peak Patrol Song for mainly its defense. Zibai does activate Peak Patrol Song's team buff, but it's only really helpful if a non-lunar sub DPS like Chiori is on the team. For non-5-star options, Zibai has two main choices. First is the not-long craftable sword as it gives a lot of defense, and second is the 3-star weapon Harbinger of Dawn because of the crit it provides, with the caveat that the 28% crit rate from its unique passive is only given if Zibai is above 90% HP. The not-long craftable is a safe baseline option, but the performance of Harbinger of Dawn can vary due to team, personal play, and the specific fight. If you are able to maintain good uptime on Harbinger of Dawn with a less defensive option like Goro, it will be better, even at just 50% uptime. But realistically, it will be hard to maintain uptime on its passive without a stronger defensive option like Zhongli. And when taking this into account, Harbinger of Dawn is similar to slightly worse than the not-long craftable. Here is a complete weapon comparison done by HyperWebster based on Zibai's personal damage in a team with C6 Illuga, C0 Columbina, and C6 Goro. Feel free to pause to take a closer look. And keep in mind that Harbinger of Dawn performs better if you are able to maintain decent uptime with just Goro and no C1 Columbina, which might be difficult to achieve. And here is a more simplified weapon comparison done by Azanihiko based on Zibai's total team damage, which is why it has lower percentages than the previous weapon comparison. It also assumes C2 Illuga instead of C6, as well as swaps C6 Goro for Zhongli for specifically Harbinger of Dawn for a more realistic assumption in its passive uptime. And the support swap leads to a lower relative performance in this particular weapon comparison. For artifacts, Zibai is a lunar-oriented main DPS, so she will want to use 4-piece Night of the Skies Unveiling. No other set really comes close in performance. For main stats, she wants Defense Hourglass, Defense Goblet, and Crit Circlet. Remember that Lunar-Crystallize damage isn't buffed by elemental damage percent, so Geo Damage Goblet isn't useful. For substats, you want to prioritize aiming for crit, then defense, then elemental mastery. If you really want to burst every rotation on Zibai, you generally need about 140 to 150 plus ER. But since this is a lot, it is highly recommended you burst every other rotation instead so you don't have to build any ER. Now, let's go over Zibai's constellations. C1 immediately gives Zibai 100 phase shift radiance points when she first uses her skill to enter her enhanced state, and it also allows her to use 5 special skills every rotation instead of 4. It also increases the damage of the first special skill she performs. The extra skill will slightly increase the rotation time, but it is well worth it as Zibai's special skills are the main source of her damage. With C2, Zibai will buff the team's Lunar-Crystallize reaction damage by 30% while she's in her enhanced state, and with Ascendant Gleam, her A1 damage buff for her special skills will be enhanced to have a higher defense scaling. C3 increases her skill talent level by 3. C4 makes her normal attack sequence not reset while in her enhanced state, allowing you to freely dodge in the middle of her attack string without interrupting it. And it also increases the damage of her N4 Lunar-Crystallize hit after she uses her special skill. C5 increases her burst talent level by 3. And lastly, C6 allows Zibai to gain phase shift radiance points 50% faster and makes her Spirit Steed Stride special skills consume all her points instead of just 70. But for every point consumed over 70, Zibai will elevate her Lunar-Crystallize damage. As a reminder, elevation is a final direct multiplier to damage, making it a potent kind of buff. Simply put, with the increased point generation and the elevation buff duration, Zibai generally gets the max 48% elevation for all her Lunar-Crystallize damage during the entirety of her on-field time. Overall, Zibai has pretty solid constellations that is typical for a newer release limited 5-star main DPS with a strong C6, C1, and C2. In regards to whether her signature or C1 is better, assuming you have her baseline weapon option, the not long craftable, her signature does give slightly more damage than her C1 based on the weapon comparisons shown in the weapon section. However, with the context that Illuga, Goro, and Aino are on our banner, and 4-star constellations are important to get the max potential out of Zibai's best teams, it is highly recommended to pull Zibai constellations over her signature weapon to have a better chance of securing C6 Illuga and C6 Goro, as well as C6 Aino for teams without Columbina. Finally, let's go over Zibai's best team comps. For this guide, I will be referencing team DPS calcs from 5 theorycrafters: Meowtooth, Hyperwebster, Azamihiko, Martin, and Timmy's Bird, who's also a content creator on YouTube and Twitch. In my opinion, multiple sources allows for a better and more nuanced understanding of a character and their performance, but as always, remember to not directly compare results from different theorycrafters or use the results to cheat PvP. While most theorycrafters follow the KQM standard for artifact investment, they all use slightly different assumptions, including gearing, rotation time, buff up time, etc., which results in slightly different numbers, making it inaccurate to directly compare one another. The actual DPS number is never that important. You may have TCers get slightly higher or slightly lower numbers for a singular team, but I'm hoping the different calcs I will show will give a general range of performance as well as plenty of other details aside from DPS. And of course, as with all sheet DPS calcs, no matter what standard is used, they will never 100% accurately reflect actual gameplay. Keep all of this in mind to ensure you consume TC healthily and responsibly. Team building with Zibai is fairly straightforward. Illuga will be releasing alongside Zibai, and he is a tailor-made support for her as he mainly buffs her direct Lunar-Crystallize damage with his burst while also easily enabling Ascended Gleam for the team. You ideally want Constellations like his C2 and C6 for even stronger buffs, and he will generally be in Zibai's best teams. Then you want at least one Hydro character for the Lunar-Crystallize reaction. With Columbina being the premier Lunar Hydro support with her off-field damage and Lunar buffs, she will be the clear best choice. The final support slot is where there are a variety of options. One of the strongest options for damage is C6 Goro because of his potent Geo crit damage and defense buffs. Plus, he also gives a small amount of healing with C4 and grants interruption resistance, which stacks with Zibai's own interruption resistance while in her enhanced state, which will be very helpful. The DPS differences in the calc shown here are mainly due to rotation time assumption, but the damage per rotation is fairly similar. However, Goro performs significantly worse without his C6, but another solid Geo support is Zhongli, as his shield provides great defensive utility on top of granting some res shred. Again, the damage difference in the calc shown here are mainly due to rotation time assumption, but the damage per rotation is similar. Now, if you have at least C2 Shilonen, then she can be used in a triple Geo team with Zibai. Her C2 allows her Geo res shred to actually work while off field in triple Geo teams, though the Geo damage isn't fully taken advantage of because Zibai's lunar damage won't be buffed. Also, C1 does give interruption resistance to the party, which is nice. However, the team still has no healing because Shilonen's burst doesn't heal in a triple Geo team. But at least damage wise, C2 Shilonen will be on par or potentially better than C6 Goro. Other viable 4th slot supports who introduce defensive utility include Dahlia and Xingqiu, who are both decent options. You can also choose to use a non-Geo or non-Hydro defensive support like Anefa, Diona, and Layla. However, introducing elements other than Geo and Hydro into teams can decrease the rate of triggering Lunar-Crystallize reactions, and since Zibai gains points from triggering Lunar-Crystallize to use her special skill, using a unit like Anefa can delay her special skill usage, which would increase the rotation time and thus negatively affect the team's damage per second. You also lose some stats on Zibai because of her A4 passive, and with Anefa specifically being a moon sign character, you also lose the Ascended Gleam lunar damage buff activated by non-moon sign characters. But these teams can still be useful as off-field cryo or electro application can help against certain enemies, and Anefa's off-field lunar charge damage can still be potent. Chiori is also a promising final support in terms of damage, especially if you have vertical investment into her. However, she doesn't provide any defensive utility, which Zibai would really like, pushing the value of C1 Columbina for her shield and Lunar-Crystallize teams. Now, if you aren't able to get many Illuga constellations, mainly less than C2, then using Zibai with Columbina, Farina or Aino, and Shilonen is a decent option. But the team has no interruption resistance, longer rotation times, fewer Lunar-Crystallize procs due to no off-field Geo, and doesn't scale very well with vertical investment. Similarly, a Benefa wheelchair team with Shilonen can work decently, but again, the team has similar issues as the double Hydro Columbina one, like not scaling well with vertical investment into Zibai. Lastly, there is the Hexerai team option with Albedo and Mona, which is alright if you don't have any other options. All these teams without Illuga are fine to play if you already have the characters for it and don't have many Illuga constellations. But if you have at least Illuga C2 and or have more investment into your Zibai, you will generally want to play the teams with Illuga. While Columbina is the best Hydro support for Zibai, she is not 100% necessary. In any of the teams with Illuga, if you are using an off-field Hydro support like Aino, Yelan, or Xingqiu instead of Columbina, the teams will still work fine. They'll just deal less damage without Columbina, though you can make up the difference with Constellations or Signature Weapon on Zibai. Damage-wise, the best Zibai team without Columbina is looking to be with C6 Illuga, C6 Aino, and C6 Goro. Of course, the big caveat here is that without C6 on all the 4-star supports, you lose a considerable amount of damage, but all of these 4-stars will be on her banner, so hopefully you get lucky when pulling on her banner, maybe getting a Zibai constellation on the way if you're skipping Columbina, which would make up the damage difference. To conclude this Zibai guide, I want to share my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Zibai is a strong Geo DPS that is very easy and straightforward to play. She simply enters her enhanced state with her skill, then spams normal attacks until she can press her special skill, which deals a significant portion of her damage, and repeats this process until her enhanced state is over. Ideally, she has minimal dashes in her combo so she can complete her entire N4 normal attack string to get an extra Lunar-Crystallize hit. And since she is a defense scaler, she will inherently be pretty tanky as well. With her best teams, Zibai is looking to be one of the strongest main DPSs in the game. Thanks to the release of Columbina, all 3 lunar DPSs in their optimal teams in fact are looking to perform as well as the best Mawika teams in terms of damage at KQM standard, assuming the non-advanced Mawika combos. Like Nefer, Zibai makes up a large portion of her team's damage, so she will scale a little bit better with more vertical investment. But overall, Flynn's, Nefer, and Zibai all perform similarly strong in their best teams with Columbina. And even in their best teams without Columbina, all 3 of them still perform very similarly. So if you choose Zibai to be the lunar DPS of your choice, she'll be solid. However, her team's optimal level of performance does require her best teammates. Just like how Flynn's pairs with Anefa and Nefer pairs with Llama, Zibai is generally paired with Illuga, the 4-star Lunar-Crystallize support releasing at the same time as her and will also be on her banner. Zibai does have team options without Illuga, but her highest damaging teams, especially when accounting for vertical investment, will be with Illuga. And while Illuga works fine at C0, he does gain significant buff increases with his constellations, such as his C2 and especially his C6, and this is where one of Zibai's biggest caveats comes in. For the highest team damage, Zibai wants C6 Illuga. You'll get copies of him while pulling on Zibai, which is definitely a plus versus needing to pull on a different limited banner for a support, but on average, getting C6 of a particular 4-star character requires more pulls than getting another limited 5-star character, such as pulling for Anefa or Llama for Flynn's or Nefer. You can definitely get lucky and get C6 Illuga very easily, or you can get extremely unlucky and not get many copies of him even after hundreds of pulls. By the time you get him at C6, you likely have Zibai C1 or even C2. In addition, one of her current other best supports is C6 Goro. So if you don't have him at C6 either and don't have any other solid support options like Zhongli, you're gonna want to pull copies of him as well. Other than needing a lot of pulls to get 4 stars at C6, 4-star supports also have an investment cap since they are 4-star characters. C6 Illuga is analogous to a C0 Llama for example, but if you are a person who pulls constellations, Llama still has 6 possible constellations that can make her even stronger, while C6 Illuga is capped. When people refer to C0 Zibai's best teams performing as well as C0 Flynn's, Nefer, and Mawika's best teams, that requires C6 Illuga, a newly released 4-star. Without C6 Illuga, Zibai is definitely still top tier, but you will be missing a good amount of team damage without it. On top of wanting C6 Illuga for optimal team performance, Zibai also benefits a lot from Columbina. Because of her all-field damage and buffs, Columbina is the best Hydra support for all 3 lunar DPSs, providing a similar damage increase to each of them. But while Zibai's best teams will include Columbina, she is arguably the lunar DPS who is the least reliant on the moon goddess. This is mainly due to Zibai's teams utilizing 4-star supports and her actual banner. The 4 stars on her banner are confirmed to have Illuga, Aino, and Goro. This lineup is on paper Zibai's best team without Columbina, assuming C6 on all the 4 stars. Since 4-star constellations, especially on Illuga, are key to buffing Zibai's damage, if you are limited in pulls, don't really care for Columbina, and want to prioritize building a strong Zibai team, I would recommend just pulling on Zibai's banner for the 4-star constellations, and likely getting constellations on Zibai as well. I usually don't put too much focus on 5-star cost comparisons between teams, but to compare 2 example teams, C1 Zibai with C6 Illuga, Aino, and Goro is the same amount of 5-star pulls as C0 Zibai, C0 Columbina, and C6 Illuga and Goro. These teams both have similar team DPS based on Calcs, as Zibai's C1 makes up for not having Columbina. However, you are very unlikely to get C6 Illuga with just pulling for C0 Zibai, but if you pull for C1 Zibai, the chances are higher since you're spending more wishes. And with Aino and Goro also being on the banner, you have a better chance of securing the ideal full C6 4-star support lineup. Columbina does provide quality of life with better Hydro application and can be a versatile support for other teams. However, if you really care for just Zibai, you may be better off focusing on pulling on her own banner for constellations of her 4-star supports, while also getting her own constellations as well. But overall, Zibai is looking to be a strong lunar DPS like Flynn's and Nefer, and will definitely be the strongest Geo DPS on release. So if you're looking for a strong lunar and Geo main DPS to help counter the lunar shill and any future Geo shill in endgame content, Zibai could be a valuable pickup for an account. That's everything I wanted to cover about Zibai. Of course, a big thank you to the theorycrafters who allowed me to showcase their calcs in this video. Meowtus, Hyperwebster, Azumihiko, Martin, and Timmy's Bird. All of them are amazing and were extremely helpful with the creation of this guide. Couldn't have done it without their support. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to you all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Zibai. Just clicking and watching the video helps the channel out immensely, and if you want to show even more support, consider liking or sharing the video, or click the subscribe button for more Genshin guide and analysis videos in the future. Leave any questions in the comments, and for all of you planning on wishing, I wish you all the best of luck on your Zibai pulls.